Hey everybody, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens, and in this, our 21st session in Storms on the Way, we delve into chapters 15 and 16 of American Gods, picking up with Shadow's vigil over the body of Odin, hanging from the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree, through his, spoilers, death, and onward into the underworld. This is a really interesting reading. I look forward to all of your contributions here in the YouTube chat. This is live on the YouTube page if you're watching the live broadcast. If you aren't watching the live broadcast but would like to, you can find out when these live broadcasts take place by heading on over to pointnorthmedia.com and clicking the podcasts button in the top corner, and you will see a calendar. If you scroll down that page a little bit, you will see a calendar with all of the live broadcasts in place. So you can hopefully find a time to join us here to discuss American Gods and Storms on the Way, or to discuss the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and There and Back Again, or a number of different texts in the Point North one-shots. This is a really interesting part of the novel, because essentially what we get between these two chapters, and we might even argue including the last chapter too, chapter 14 too, but really chapters 15 and 16 form our transition into the third act of American Gods. And I talked about our fairly recent midpoint in American Gods and the way in which the elongated first act in this novel compresses the rest of the action. And that, I think, is purposeful, because one of the things that Gaiman accomplishes by compressing the structure in what is effectively the back half of the novel is he creates a space in which the tone can be elevated. He basically makes American Gods much more mythic and much less mundane. The rest of the book, what awaits us in our final 2 weeks of reading here on Storms on the Way, is fundamentally, stridently, almost violently dissimilar to anything that has preceded it. We are going to see next week and in the following week a very different kind of story unfolding with a very different tone and a very different register. And these chapters, 15 and 16, form the crucible that allows us to transition from fundamentally the mundane into the magical, from the real world into the realm of gods. And of course, we've been navigating that threshold, that transition throughout the novel, really from the first page of the novel. Particularly once we realize the real identity of Loki Lysmith, we begin to understand, no, wait, we've always been kind of coexisting between these two spaces, but this is the part of the book that breaks that connection with the mundane world. What comes next will not be what we have known thus far. And yes, some minor spoilers. Hey, just a few spoilers here in these chapters. So I don't normally make this disclaimer right at the beginning, but hey, you guys, if you haven't read American Gods, go read American Gods before we move into these chapters, because there are a couple of details that we're probably going to cover in the course of the next hour or so that you probably want to experience on the page before you hear me talk about them freely here on the podcast. So as I say, you guys can contribute here in the YouTube chat. You can also contribute on Twitter, either during the live show or after the fact, using the hashtag StormsOTW, StormsOTW, the 21st session here in Storms on the Way. And I still have to struggle with that hashtag. Not great branding, you guys, I think, is what we're learning. And if we learn anything from the pages of American Gods, if we learn anything in particular from next week's reading, it is that branding is of absolute importance. Good. Excellent. Let's get to it then with the first day, the first passage here from chapter 15. Let me share this slide with you. The first day that Shadow hung from the tree, he experienced only discomfort that edged slowly into pain and fear, and occasionally an emotion that was somewhere between boredom and apathy, a gray acceptance, a waiting. He hung. The wind was still. After several hours, fleeting bursts of color started to explode across his vision in blossoms of crimson and gold, throbbing and pulsing with a life of their own. The pain in his arms and legs became, by degrees, intolerable. If he relaxed them, let his body go slack and dangle. If he flopped forward, then the rope around his neck would take up the slack and the world would shimmer and swim. So he pushed himself back against the trunk of the tree. He could feel his heart laboring in his chest, a pounding, a rhythmic tattoo as it pumped the blood through his body. Emeralds and sapphires and rubies crystallized and burst in front of his eyes. His breath came in shallow gulps. The bark of the tree was rough against his back. The chill of the afternoon on his naked skin made him shiver, made his flesh prickle and goose. "It's easy," said someone in the back of his head. "There's a trick to it. Either you do it, or you die." It was a wise thing to have thought, he decided. He was pleased with it and repeated it over and over in the back of his head, part mantra, part nursery rhyme, rattling along to the drumbeat of his heart. "It's easy, there's a trick to it, you do it or you die. It's easy, there's a trick to it, you do it or you die. It's easy, there's a trick to it, you do it or you die. It's easy, there's a trick to it, you do it or you die." Shadow's experience of the vigil, Shadow's experience of being hung upon the branches of Yggdrasil here is depicted in surprisingly kind of subtle and thoughtful terms. We are given a perspective on Shadow's interiority, Shadow's actual literal experience, which is uncommon, honestly, in the pages of the book. We only really get these insights into Shadow's experience when they are A, directly and immediately relevant, and B, also thematically relevant. There are moments when we might expect to be more deeply in Shadow's POV in the course of the book, and we're not. We're held in abeyance. We're held at arm's length, oftentimes by these curt little lines that Gaiman gives us. And we get a couple of those here. He hung, the wind was still. And then we expand again into that fourth, fifth paragraph, I guess, as we're looking at the slide here. The pain in his arms and legs became by degrees intolerable, and we get a deeper sense of what it is that Shadow's going through. This is going to be a challenge, but immediately we begin to see, I think we begin to suspect a little why it is that Shadow has taken up this challenge, why it is that Shadow has agreed to watch over the body of Odin, why he has agreed to stand this vigil. It is in part about their compact. It is in part about their agreement and the requirement to simply do the thing. He made a promise, effectively, and he's going to see that through. But as we saw, as we foreshadowed first in the conversation with Laura in the graveyard outside of Lakeside, and then again in his conversation with Wednesday, then again in his conversation with Nancy and Chernobog, this is about something more than that. This is about living. And here, as Shadow's body blossoms into pain, as he blossoms first into discomfort and then into outright pain and agony, he is feeling alive. The emphasis that is put on his heart and on his blood, this is his vitality. This is going to become even more acute as we move through these chapters, and Shadow's heart becomes actually very significant to the movement of the plot for a few pages. But even now, we're seeing a vibrancy that we don't often associate with Shadow, and we can see that right here on the page. The first day that Shadow hung from the tree, he experienced only discomfort that edged slowly into pain and fear, and occasionally an emotion that was somewhere between boredom and apathy, a gray acceptance, a waiting. How familiar is this to Shadow? How much of Shadow's experience can be described as somewhere between boredom and apathy, a gray acceptance, a waiting? And then he flowers into actual pain, actual discomfort, actual, crucially, physicality. That's going to be very interesting as we move forward. There are some questions here in the YouTube chat. Jonathan actually raised this point. I'm kind of baffled by the idea of seeing this done on the small screen. Not sure how it's going to work, but looking forward to seeing them try. This is interesting, particularly because of the lynching imagery, the very powerful lynching imagery that we've seen already in American Gods, the TV show. It is crucial to note, and I expect the show to back away from the association with lynching in this regard, because Shadow is not being hanged, he is bound. And as a consequence of that, if he lets his body falter, then it is a pressure on his neck that will ultimately, decide his fate there. But he is bound, and the binding to Yggdrasil is so mythically important that I don't think we're going to conflate that very simply with the lynching metaphor that has been so prevalent in the first season of American Gods. And hopefully, I'm optimistic with no basis whatsoever. I guess I'm hopeful is closer to the truth. I'm hopeful that we're going to see them dial back some of that lynching imagery and some of that heavy-handed approach to racial politics and to questions of integration and segregation in modern America. I think that there are some very interesting angles and perspectives that we've had on that in the course of the first season of the TV show, but I think that we've probably tapped that barrel for now. At least we have tapped... What is it that I want to say? I want to say that we have pretty much exhausted that as a metaphor if we are just going to continually repeat it. I think we've gotten all that we can get from the lynching metaphor in the Starz adaptation of American Gods to date. Yes. At this point, says Becca, this is lovely. At this point, he is literally bound to myth, and it is so good. Yes, that's absolutely right. He has been plucked utterly from the mundane world. And now, because we've seen him transit before, right? We've seen him spend time at the House on the Rock, and we've seen him pass backstage in the Dakotas, and we've seen him have these momentary interactions and Zoraya Polokanaya's rooftop, and he's existed in these magical, super real spaces, but he hasn't been embodied in those spaces as fully as he is now. Now there is no remnant of the natural world left. There's not even a metaphor of the natural world left. He is literally bound to Yggdrasil to stand vigil over Odin. That is where we are. This is Shadow's experience. And as we move through these chapters, we're going to see what few remnants there are of the mundane world left falling away. Shadow is going to be increasingly defined in terms of gods, in terms of this community. Laura's going to show up in a little bit, but she is not going to define the course of his journey here. He is going to transit from his previous human experience into the realm of gods, absolutely. And of course, we're going to get a major nod as to why that may be the case as we move forward. A minor note here for those of you not as well versed, perhaps, as you may be in Norse mythology, the squirrel is not a kind of somewhat whimsical invention of Gaiman. The squirrel is a whimsical inclusion on the part of Gaiman, but not an outright invention. I'm going to struggle to pronounce this. Ratatoskr is the squirrel who carries messages between the hawk who flies at the uppermost branches of Yggdrasil and the worm beneath its roots. So there is in Norse myth a serpent, a dragon, curled around and beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, and there is a hawk that flies above, and the squirrel is of the tree. Neither of these entities they exist above and below, but the squirrel exists among, and the squirrel passes messages from the upper world to the lower. So the squirrel coming and bringing water to Shadow is weird and whimsical and feels a little Disney sometimes, but is at least consistent with Norse mythology, with the inspiration there. Yeah, good. Ratatosk is one of the residents of the World Tree, says Jonathan Nash. Yes, yes. And Angela asks an interesting question. These chapters are the true climax of the book, right? Well, I guess we can only really address that question when we have finished the book and we can really look back at its structure. I would say no. I would say that Shadow's humanity, while it seems... Okay, spoilers for those of you who have only read the reading and haven't read ahead. Shadow does not die at this time. I'm telling you this because you look concerned. Shadow is going to continue through the rest of the book. He's going to emerge kind of from the underworld here, and he's going to continue through the rest of the book. And while this is transformative, I do think that it is Shadow's humanity that defines his arc here. We'll talk about that in the weeks to come. Yeah, good. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide here as we move into an odd piece of foreshadowing, I suppose, but also an interesting reference. Oh, I didn't even mention, back on that first slide, there's a trick to it. There's a trick to it. Of course, the emphasis that has been put upon tricks throughout the entire book cannot be overlooked here. There is a trick to survival. And what is the nature of a trick? Well, a trick, as we know, comes in two parts. It comes in the practical application of craft, the practice of the trick itself, but it also comes in the form of the narrative that envelops, that is wrapped around the trick itself. That is to say that Shadow has to do the thing, but he also has to tell the story. He has to believe the story. He has to be suspended by narrative at least as much as he's suspended by rope, and we're going to see how that works for him as he moves through the rest of the chapter, approaching his death here. The pain woke him several times in the next few hours. It pulled him from a dark dream in which dead children rose and came to him, their eyes peeling swollen pearls, and they reproached him for failing them. And it pulled him from another dream in which he was staring up at a mammoth, hairy and dark as it lumbered toward him from the mist, but awake for a moment. A spider edging across his face, and he shook his head, dislodging or frightening it. Now the mammoth was an elephant-headed man, pot-bellied, one tusk broken, and he was riding toward Shadow on the back of a huge mouse. The elephant-headed man curled his trunk toward Shadow and said, "If you had invoked me before you began this journey, perhaps some of your troubles might have been avoided." Then the elephant took the mouse, which had, by some means that Shadow could not perceive, become tiny while not changing in size at all, and passed it from hand to hand to hand, fingers curling about it as the little brown creature scampered from palm to palm, and Shadow was not at all surprised when the elephant-headed god finally opened all four of his hands to reveal them perfectly empty. He shrugged arm after arm after arm in a peculiar fluid motion and looked at Shadow, his face unreadable. "It's in the trunk," Shadow told the elephant man, who had seen the flickering tail vanish. The elephant man nodded his huge head and said, "Yes, in the trunk. You will forget many things. You will give many things away. You will lose many things, but do not lose this." And then the rains began, and Shadow was awake once more. He tumbled, shivering and wet, from deep sleep to wakefulness in moments. The shivering intensified until it scared Shadow. He was shivering more violently than he had ever imagined possible, a series of convulsive shudders which built upon each other. He willed himself to stop shaking, but still he shivered. His teeth banging together, his limbs twitching and jerking beyond his control. There was real pain there, too, a deep, knife-like pain that covered his body with tiny, invisible wounds, intimate and unbearable. He is here again, more alive than he has ever been. I see a couple of you have anticipated my big reveal here. This isn't particularly arcane or obscure, particularly by the standards of Neil Gaiman and the work that he has done in the pages of American Gods. The elephant-headed man, pot-bellied with one tusk broken. This is, and 4 arms, of course, this is Ganesh, who is oftentimes invoked as a guardian on long journeys. So this line about, if you had invoked me before you began this journey, perhaps some of your troubles might have been avoided. This is absolutely true to Ganesh's kind of framework of belief, to the theology of Ganesh, if you like. Yes, it's in the trunk. For those of you who have not yet finished the novel, put a pin in that. It's in the trunk is going to be directly relevant. But what we see here, again, besides, of course, Gaiman's utterly magnificent and luminous prose, that first paragraph, that first extended paragraph is just gorgeous. The intercession, the hard cut away, awake for a moment, a spider edging across his face, and he shook his head, dislodging or frightening it. Now the mammoth was an elephant-headed man. We're straight back in again. It's beautifully suspended. It's enormously intimate, and still Shadow is alive. And we see, too, of course, the practice of a trick. It's interesting, therefore, that Ganesh doesn't tell a story. It's interesting that Ganesh doesn't do what a magician does. Ganesh practices this trick exactly the same way as Shadow has practiced his tricks previously. He's good at the practice. He's good at the physical manipulation of the object. He can do the vanish, but he can't tell the story, or so he believed, at least in the past. He couldn't tell his story. Ganesh doesn't tell a story. Ganesh doesn't try to tell a story. And in the absence of a story, the trick is transparent. The trick is revealed. A strong story would have distracted Shadow's attention from the trunk. It would have distracted Shadow's attention to a pocket or one of the mighty hands of Ganesh or something. But in the absence of the story, the trick is revealed. The trick, in a sense, I guess in one sense becomes transparent. The mechanic of the trick is revealed, but in the other, and a much more powerful sense, the trick doesn't work. The trick doesn't achieve its stated intention, which is to trick, which is to baffle and confound. In the absence of the story, the trick is left naked and ineffective. Yeah. Yes, we can't talk about the trunk. We definitely can't talk about the trunk here. Yes. As Keepa points out in the YouTube chat, it's a bit of a fever dream. That's beautifully observed. Yes, that's exactly what it is. That's exactly how it feels. And again, we get heat and blood and pain. We get all of these, even the shaking. Shadow's body right now is doing something that he didn't think it was possible, didn't think possible. He didn't think his body could do this. And he is, in a weird way, more alive than he was before. Here, hanging suspended between the living and dying worlds, between life and death himself, he is more alive. Turns out that Laura knew what she was talking about. Let's push on to, in fact, speaking of Laura, let's push on to our first of 2 appearances from Laura. This is textually the vision of Laura. That is not to suggest that the second appearance is not textually the vision of Laura. We'll get to that in a moment. His life was laid out below him on the motel sheet shroud, literally laid out, like the items at some Dada picnic, a surrealist tableau. He could see his mother's puzzled stare, the American embassy in Norway, Laura's eyes on their wedding day. He chuckled through dry lips. "What's so funny, puppy?" asked Laura. "Our wedding day," he said. "You bribed the organist to change from playing the wedding march to the theme song from Scooby-Doo as you walked toward me down the aisle. Do you remember?" "Of course I remember, darling. I would have made it too, if it wasn't for those meddling kids." "I loved you so much," said Shadow. He could feel her lips on his, and they were warm and wet and living, not cold and dead, so he knew that this was another hallucination. "You aren't here, are you?" he asked. "No," she said, "but you're calling me for the last time, and I am coming." Breathing was harder now. The ropes cutting his flesh were an abstract concept like free will or eternity. "Sleep, puppy," she said. although he thought it might have been his own voice he heard, and he slept. Becca Eller says in the YouTube chat, I want that wedding march. And Aaron raises an interesting point. Okay, that seems way too cool a move for Laura's established character. And hey, you guys, I've got to tell you, this is the most powerful moment in this book so far, where book Laura has reminded me of TV Laura. That distinction, because let's face it, TV Laura is all but an absolute creation. You know, she's obviously anchored in book Laura, but she's essentially a new character. We get a depth and a dynamism and interiority and understanding of and from Laura, which is so far in excess of what we get from the book that she might as well be an original character. But hey, this is a character detail that I recognize. I could absolutely imagine TV Laura doing this. But you're right, book Laura, this seems too odd and too cool unless she is doing it out of, unless this is not coolness, unless she's not playing a trick, unless she's not trying to be funny, but she's trying to undercut the solemnity of her wedding to Shadow. If she is trying to, you know, spike that particular punch, if she is trying to somehow remove some of the solemnity and gravitas from the ceremony so that she might survive it, that, as sad and as tragic as it is, may actually be more kind of connected to my understanding of Laura, at least. But it is a very, very, it is a very good joke. I approve of that a great deal. Then we get the realization. Okay, so first off, his life was laid out before him on the motel sheet shroud, literally laid out like the items on some Dada picnic, a surrealist tableau. He could see his mother's puzzled stare, the American embassy in Norway, Laura's eyes on their wedding day. He is seeing the events of his life laid out before him. And stay tuned, because he's going to start walking through the events of his life as he navigates the underworld. But here we get a foreshadowing of that, the kind of literalization and externalization of the details of Shadow's life into the world around him, laid out here, of course, on the sheet which is binding the body of Odin itself. Then he has this very human memory about the Scooby-Doo theme, which, again, I love. I wouldn't have hated if they'd included that in the show, I have to say. But then, much more importantly, the realization that this is not Laura that he's talking to. And therefore, we can't trust Laura's responses here. We know for sure that we can't trust that last line. Sleep, puppy, she said, although he thought it might have been his own voice he heard, and he slept. Here he is losing that condition of being alive, that aliveness, which has sustained him so far. He is losing it here. He's moving, as we see, the ropes cutting his flesh were an abstract concept like free will or eternity. It is becoming harder to directly emotionally connect with the physical condition of his body. He is losing his connection to his own physicality and to life. Yeah. Oh, this is interesting. Skipa says, if Laura has always believed that Shadow wasn't alive, maybe changing the song was to help him feel something strongly. That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Good. I like that reading, Skipa. Good job. And Tom says, the use of the word shroud seems purposeful considering the book is full of religious iconography and reference. Yes, I mean, you know, literally a shroud, literally it is that, but it is also more than that. I think you're right, where we're leaning into other kinds of religious iconography and religious tradition, because we're still, well, I guess this is an open question, isn't it? To what degree is Shadow's experience of Yggdrasil unique to Shadow? To what degree is this entire thing objectively happening? And to what degree are we so deeply in Shadow's POV that he himself is drawing in elements? And I guess the broader question, to what degree is this space mutable by Shadow's expectation and belief? Let's continue to bear that in mind as we move forward, particularly as we move into chapter 16. Then, after the vision of Laura, we get the real Laura, question mark? He croaked, "Hello, Laura." She looked up at him with dead eyes and she smiled. "How did you find me?" he asked. She was silent for a while in the moonlight. Then she said, "You're the nearest thing I have to life. You're the only thing I have left, the only thing that isn't bleak and flat and gray. I could be blindfolded and dropped into the deepest ocean, and I would know where to find you. I could be buried 100 miles underground, and I would know where you are." He looked down at the woman in the moonlight, and his eyes stung with tears. "I'll cut you down," she said after a while. "I spend too much time rescuing you, don't I?" He coughed again. Then, "No, Leave me. I have to do this. She looked up at him and shook her head. You're crazy, she said. You're dying up there, or you'll be crippled if you aren't already. Maybe, he said, but I'm alive. Yes, she said after a moment. I guess you are. We didn't mention in the last slide Shadow's sucker punch, gut punch use of the past tense. I loved you so much. And we didn't frame that in terms of his underlying intent. Because there were two possible interpretations of that line from the last slide, I loved you so much. The first is, I loved you and love you no longer. The second is, Shadow loved you and Shadow is no longer. That I am near death in a way that renders all of my experience past tense. How do we track that idea as we move into this confrontation? Particularly as Laura gives her reflection on her condition of aliveness, on her own vitality and existence and perspective and drive now. This is vital. As Jonathan says here in the YouTube chat, and here we see where they got Laura's vision of the world in the show. This is a really nice character beat for her. You're the nearest thing I have to life. You're the only thing I have left. The only thing that isn't bleak and flat and gray. Now, look at the punctuation there. You are the nearest thing I have to life, period. You are the only thing I have left, comma, the only thing that isn't bleak and flat and gray. That is to combine those two, the latter two ideas. You are the only thing I have left, the only thing that isn't bleak and flat and gray. That is to say, everything else that I have left, if I have anything left, is bleak and flat and gray. You are the only thing I have left that isn't bleak and flat and gray. Therefore, you are the nearest thing I have to life. What does that mean? And how are we supposed to interpret that from Shadow's perspective here, from Shadow's POV? Because as he says explicitly in this slide, I'm doing this thing. I'm dying, potentially, as Laura says, you'll be crippled if you aren't already. He says, no, I'm alive. That's vital to Shadow. That's the reason that he's doing this. And now that he's doing this, and it is actually literally killing him, it's still important enough a reason that he's going to see it through. So what do we make of Laura's perspective on this? Does Shadow have something that isn't bleak and flat and gray? Well, I'm reminded of the emotion between boredom and apathy that introduced this chapter. Flat and gray. And then we get these flowers, these blossoms of pain, these bright colors in front of his eyes, these jewels in front of his eyes, his emeralds and his sapphires, vivid and sharp-edged. He is alive, but he is not connected to Laura in the way that Laura is connected to Shadow, crucially. There's no sense that he sees from her, okay, I guess we don't want to co-opt the vocabulary of the TV show. What we can say instead is there's no sense that he knows where she is. He didn't know that she was coming. He didn't know until they kissed that the first vision of Laura was not Laura. He doesn't have the same insight into her as she has into him, and yet it is that insight into him that defines Laura's life. Except, of course, that Laura isn't really alive. Laura isn't really living. Not even the kind of not even the kind of half alive, half dead existence that Shadow had before all of this. She's dead. She's just still moving around. And he's the closest thing. The nearest thing I have to life for Laura is not life. It's still different. This is the moment where Shadow slips away from his connection with Laura. Maybe he said, but I'm alive. Yes, she said after a moment, I guess you are. That's effectively the end of their conversation. That is effectively the end of their time together. This is not going to be a rescue. This is not going to be salvation. This is something else. This is Shadow, in effect, arguably being tempted. Laura could cut him down. She could actually save him. He could turn his back on this, but no, he's going to see it through. If dying is the only way that he can be alive, then apparently he is going to die. Good. Is it based on Laura being a little selfish? This is, let me see. Oh, this is my Laura, says Becca Eller. This Laura is my Laura, and I love her Laura-ness. That's very good. And Tom says, is it based on Laura being a little selfish and afraid of the rest of her existence? She likes being close to life, even if she can't actually be in life anymore. We just don't know. We just don't know the consequence of the coin. This is one of the smartest pieces of adaptation that we've had from the TV show, and not even necessarily the specific story that they told. But if you're looking at American Gods as a text, the biggest unanswered question is, but what with Laura, though? The why and the wherefore of Laura is not even conspicuous in its absence, is unavoidable in its absence. It is a huge gap in the story, and a purposeful, intentional gap. This isn't to say that Gaiman made a mistake by not telling this story, but if you're looking to adapt this tale and add extra detail, that's the first place you go. They've made other more subtle adaptive choices, like the expansion of Mad Sweeney's role, for example, in the TV show. That's, again, I think a really good choice, and those two things obviously very intimately connected. But we don't know enough about Laura's condition here. We don't know what it is that's driving her. We don't know what it is that's connecting to her, that's connecting her to Shadow. We know that it feels like love, and we know that it feels like life, but we can also suspect or infer that it is neither of those things. What is it that has resurrected Laura and brought her back? We still don't know. Let's push on to the end of this chapter, this very brief chapter here. Let me see. We're talking about grabbing a TARDIS so that we can, Becca suggested, we're going to find the TARDIS and go watch Gaiman write the book. We all put on aprons and pretend to be working there. That's excellent. Yes. Very good. Very good. All right. Oh, no. Elizabeth says in the YouTube chat, dying is easy, young man. Living is harder. Cruel and frankly unnecessary, but also, of course, completely apposite. Let's take a look then at the final beat of Shadow's heart. A crashing and a pounding in his head, beyond the pain of migraine, beyond all pain, everything dissolved into tiny butterflies, which circled him like a multicolored dust storm and that evaporated into the night. The white sheet wrapped around the body at the base of the tree flapped noisily in the morning wind. The pounding eased. Everything slowed. There was nothing left to make him keep breathing. His heart ceased to beat in his chest. The darkness that he entered this time was deep and lit by a single star, and it was final. The death of Shadow Moon. The riotous collapse into silence here, the crashing and the pounding, beyond the pain of a migraine, beyond all pain. It isn't even pain anymore. Now it is just sensation. Now it is just exposure. Now it is just reaction. Everything dissolved into tiny butterflies, which circled him like a multicolored dust storm and then evaporated into the night. That's the moment of passing and release. So we get 3 beats here, I suppose. The first, this riot of sensation that abates, that evaporates, that leaves him behind. Then the white sheet wrapped around the body at the base of the tree flapped noisily in the morning wind. The natural world, or whatever passes for the natural world here, continues, even as Shadow slows. The pounding eased, everything slowed. There was nothing left to make him keep breathing. His heart ceased to beat in his chest. Nothing left to make him keep breathing. The sense of obligation there, the sense of duty, or of at least response, is curious, is fascinating. What is it that makes us keep breathing? And the answer is us. The thing that was keeping Shadow breathing was Shadow. It was his shadowness. It was his life. And now that has abated. There's nothing left to keep him breathing. His heart ceased to beat in his chest. The darkness that he entered this time was deep and lit by a single star, and it was final. There's the death of Shadow Moon. Good. Let me see. The death of Shadow Moon, so beautiful, says Angela. I completely agree. Yes. Jonathan Nash says, death is the last friend in a lot of Gaiman's work. He and Pratchett have that in common. At the last, your oldest friend takes you by the hand and guides you into something new. Yes. And Becca calls that Deathly Hallows, of course. Yes, which is interesting in this regard, too, because that's not incompatible with what we've seen from gods of death. Not so much the classic Grim Reaper anthropomorphic personification that we get in the Discworld novels, but more a kind of classic theological guide to death, as we're going to discover, in fact. Psychopomps. Psychopomps are what we're talking about here in part. We'll get to all of that in a few pages' time. That is the end of chapter 15. And we move into chapter 16. This then forms the end of chapter 15, the moment of Shadow's death, basically forms a tipping point here in the narrative as a whole, but also in this transition into the third act. We get the pre-death sequence and then the post-death sequence, and those two things unified become this transition for Shadow. So he is already in a liminal state, but he is transitioning into a new liminal state, and then will, at the end of chapter 16, transition into yet another new state. We're demarcating the boundaries very closely here. And we've talked about this a few times before, and perhaps never really given it the emphasis that we ought. This book is replete with thresholds, with the transition from and to, with the transition there and back again, if you like, with very short, very brief liminal periods that are occasionally expanded. Arguably, the entire House on the Rock sequence is a liminal phase in Shadow's experience. I'm not talking metaphysically here. I mean, it is literally a liminal space, metaphysically speaking, as is the backstage that we see in the Dakotas, as is presumably wherever Shadow is right now, bound to Yggdrasil. These are, you know, specifically liminal spaces. They exist between, but they are also narratively liminal spaces. That is to say that they are liminal for Shadow's subjective experience. He is caught between. Nothing is anchored or resolved at the House on the Rock. It isn't anchored until he returns to the mundane world. The same is true backstage in the Dakotas. The same is true, arguably, here too. So here he transitions into the underworld, and we get this movement. The darkness that he entered this time was deep and lit by a single star, and it was final. But of course, Shadow's not moving because Shadow is still bound. So the degree or the nature of that movement, the aspect of Shadow that moves, is also an interesting one. We'll talk about that as we move forward too. Yeah, good. My death would be voiced by Brian Blessed, says Tom. Yes, Aaron says, if I could choose the death to meet me, mine would talk like this. That's in all caps. That's the Pratchett death there. Yes, good. I'm not sure if mine would talk like this, says Jonathan Nash, or show up as a pale goth girl with the loveliest of black parasols asking me to help her sort her music. Jonathan, that doesn't sound too bad at all. Yes, Becca Eller says, my death would be voiced by Sean Bean because he really understands death. One does not simply walk into the underworld. Yes. Good. All right. And Princess Ostrich says, if you get another one, I would send it back. You don't want to have a suboptimal death experience. After all, YOLO. Very nicely done. Very nicely done. Okay, let's take a look here as we move into chapter 6, and we get our introduction to the first of a host of characters returning from earlier in the book. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Zoraya Polokonaya. He knew suddenly what would happen next. Zoraya Polokonaya would be there. She was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. There was no moon in the sky, but she was bathed in moonlight nonetheless. Her white hair was moon pale, and she wore the same lace and linen nightdress she had worn that night in Chicago. She smiled when she saw him and looked down as if momentarily embarrassed. Hello, she said. Hi, said Shadow. How are you? I don't know, he said. I think this is maybe another strange dream on the tree. I've been having crazy dreams since I got out of prison. Her face was silvered by the moonlight, but no moon hung in the plum-black sky, and now at the foot of the steps, even the single star was lost to view, and she looked both solemn and vulnerable. She said, all your questions can be answered if that is what you want. But once you learn your answers, you can never unlearn them. You have to understand that. I got it, he said. Beyond her, the path forked. He would have to decide which path to take. He knew that. But there was one thing he had to do first. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and was relieved when he felt the familiar weight of the coin at the bottom of the pocket. He eased it out, held it between finger and thumb, a 1922 Liberty dollar. This is yours, he said. There is no moon in the sky, because, of course, the moon is in Shadow's pocket. Figuratively speaking, all of this is figurative, you guys. None of this is really happening. Shadow's realization that he is wearing the same clothes that he wore on that night in Chicago, and therefore understanding that he is about to transition back to the rooftop and then forward, the path forked. This is figurative. And we could spend a long while parsing every single individual metaphor in this chapter. The previous chapter too, to a certain extent, but this chapter specifically. And I don't want to do that for two reasons. The first is that I'm fearful of losing track of the wood for the trees here. I'm fearful that if we focus on each incidental detail and try to parse it, that it will somehow overshadow our understanding of the movement of the story. And the movement of the story is so important that I want to keep our attention there. We're going to look at the big picture details. That's not to say that we can't parse some of these finer metaphors, but we don't necessarily need to, particularly because, point B, in my defense of this approach, I'm not sure how many of these incidental details are supposed to be transparent to the reader. Leaning more here, less on the kind of allegorical theological tradition that we see in, you know, medieval tales, that we see in stories of transition into the afterlife in every major, you know, religious group. Rather, it seems to me that he is resting more upon his skill as a magical realist, that he is here creating something that is supposed to be bewitching and unearthly, but nevertheless makes an emotional sense. What is the meaning of the path on the rooftop? What is the meaning of the presence of Zoraya Polokanaya here? We can parse those things. We can understand them. Do we believe that this is really Zoraya? Well, yes, I think I do. I think that I'm comfortable with the idea that gods can coexist on Earth and here in the underworld too. The Zorayas in particular, and of course she would be the one here. I'm tracking here the conversation in the YouTube chat, talking about redos in death, talking about do-overs in death. Yes, if there's a way to figure that out, that would be extremely helpful indeed. I like the idea very much of just filing a bad Yelp review and saying, I'm sorry, this was a subpar death experience, and I would like to be gifted a gift certificate for one more try. That would be fantastic. And of course, if you're interested in death experiences, absolutely go and read Pratchett, go and read the Discworld novels, go and read the death novels in particular, because they're just fantastic. Yeah. Yes, and Skipa says, I believe the gods are real in this, as real as anything is, because as you say, this is a liminal space. That's a great catch, Skipa, that this is both, again, narratively and metaphysically connected to the previous liminal spaces that we've explored, whether that's the House on the Rock or backstage, or these moments here on the rooftop, even arguably the moments with Chernobog. I mean, we can see moments in which we move out of the realm of reality partially or absolutely. But yeah, good. So all of your questions can be answered if that is what you want, but once you learn your answers, you can never unlearn them. You have to understand them. The difference between ignorance and understanding, that carries us on to our next slide. Take one, and you cannot take the other, she said, but neither path is safe. Which way would you walk? The way of hard truths or the way of fine lies? Shadow hesitated. Truths, he said. I've come too far for more lies. She looked sad. There will be a price, she said. I'll pay it. What's the price? Your name, she said. Your real name, you will have to give it to me. How? Like this, she said. She reached a perfect hand toward his head. He felt her fingers brush his skin, and he felt them penetrate his skin. His skull felt them push deeper into his head. Something tickled in his skull and all down his spine. She pulled her hand out of his head. A flame, like a candle flame, but burning with a clear magnesium white luminance, was flickering on the tip of her forefinger. Is that my name? He asked. She closed her hand and the light was gone. It was, she said. She extended her hand and pointed to the right-hand path. That way, she said, for now. Nameless, Shadow walked down the right-hand path in the moonlight. When he turned around to thank her, he saw nothing but darkness. It seemed to him that he was deep under the ground, but when he looked up into the darkness above him, he still saw the tiny moon. He turned a corner. If this was the afterlife, he thought, it was a lot like the House on the Rock, part diorama, part nightmare. It may be more true to say that, rather than saying the underworld is rather like the House on the Rock, it may be more true to say that the House on the Rock is rather like the underworld. Yes. Good. Yes, now the Nameless Shadow walks the paths of the dead and Gaiman wins, says Jonathan Nash. Nameless Shadow, Angela confirms here. Yes, his name has been taken. Let's take a look, though, at... We're basically going to get a 3-beat here, okay? Shadow is going to make this choice 3 times. He's going to choose between the paths opened to him 3 times in the span of this chapter, and that is not, of course, incidental. That is not something that we can trivially overlook. 3 beats are always important. Choices are always important. And unifying those two things within the span of a single chapter is vital. This is the passage through the underworld, it seems to me, is the making of these choices. These are the moments in which Shadow has real agency. The rest of the time, though he is choosing to move forward, he is passive in his experience. He is responsive in his experience. Take one and you cannot take the other, she said, but neither path is safe. Which way would you walk? The way of hard truths or the way of fine lies? Shadow says truth. He wants the way of hard truths, not the way of fine lies. But here's the thing. She just said neither path is safe. So the truths are hard and the lies are fine, but they are made dangerous by both of those things. Neither path is safe, hard truths or fine lies. When he says truths, she looks sad and says, there will be a price. Is this a price for choosing truth? Is this a price for choosing? What would Shadow have paid if he had chosen the path of lies? Would he have given up something other than his real name? Would he have given up his false name? Nameless, Shadow walked down the right-hand path in the moonlight. There is, of course, a literary irony there, nameless Shadow, but also nameless Shadow walked. And now we realize that Shadow Moon's implausibly cool name has never been real. We know that it's something of a nickname, but it has never transcended that. If you call someone by a nickname for long enough, it becomes their name. That's nominative truth right there. Names shape to fit objects and objects shape to fit names. That's the concept of nominative determinism. By naming something, we define it. We give it its essence. Shadow here has been named. He's had a name. We've used this name repeatedly, but now that his real name has been taken, he has still lost something, even though he is still Shadow. So nameless, he moves forward. I wonder if the price was the same, but the experience would be different, and that's what Zoraya is reacting to, says Skipa in the YouTube channel. That's an interesting one. I'm not sure that Shadow would have lost his false name if he had taken the path of lies. It's possible, certainly. It's possible that he wouldn't have had to pay a price. The hard truth demands from you. The easy lie, presumably the fine lie as it's presented here, would instead manipulate you. There would be, a descent into deadly peace, a dangerous peace here. Yeah, good. Yes, and of course, Jonathan is saying here in the YouTube chat, but not in a lot of mystical stories. In those stories, names are something much more powerful and usually hidden. Yes, the power of names is absolutely inextricable from the oldest kinds of stories. Fairy tales, the oral tradition in its entirety, in fact, are replete with examples of the importance of names. Good. Good. Okay. Let's move on to, you guys, it's a big reveal. Let's get right to it. Shadow found that he was completely unsurprised, when he recognized the man who dances with her. He had not changed that much in 33 years. She is drunk. Shadow could see that at a glance. She is not very drunk, but she is unused to drink, and in a week or so she will take a ship to Norway. They have been drinking margaritas, and she has salt on her lips and salt clinging to the back of her hand. Wednesday is not wearing a suit and tie, but the pin in the shape of a silver tree he wears over the pocket of his shirt glitters and glints when the mirror ball light catches it. He does not dance badly. They make a fine-looking couple, considering the difference in their ages. There is a lupine grace to his movements. A slow dance. He pulls her close to him, and his paw-like hand curves around the seat of her skirt possessively, moving her closer to him. His other hand takes her chin, pushes it upward into his face, and the two of them kiss, there on the floor, as the glitter ball lights circle them into the center of the universe. Soon after, they leave. She sways against him, and he leads her from the dance hall. Shadow buries his head in his hands, and he does not follow them, unable or unwilling to witness his own conception. The mirror lights were gone, and now the only illumination came from the tiny moon that burned high above his head. So we had here, as Shadow moves into the underworld, a single star illuminating the darkness. He loses sight of that star when he is on the Zoraya's rooftop. He's on the Chicago rooftop, the recreation of that. But the moon is replaced. And now the star is gone and the moon instead shines out. The tiny moon, we get that repetition several times in the course of the chapter. The tiny moon is shining down, not the single solitary star. The star seems to have been replaced by the return of the moon? Is it possible that the star is simply a weaker form of the moon, that a brighter light has returned now, that has been superseded, that the return of the coin and all that the coin represents has removed the necessity for the star? Possibly, possibly. Hey, you guys, that's not the most important thing about this slide. It turns out that Wednesday is Shadow's father. That at some point prior to the trip to the embassy in Norway, Wednesday seduced Shadow's mother. And I say seduced because if you remember back in our discussion of chapter 9, I drew your attention to a small detail. Wednesday sketching runes in salt. This is when they're in La Crosse, Wisconsin. This is at Christmas. And this is after we get the two stories of the cons, the fiddle con and the bishop game. And Wednesday knocks the salt shaker over and inscribes little runic charms in it to make the waitress go home with him. And as he touches her, he leaves crumbs of salt, fragments of salt behind on her skin. And Shadow is upset by this because, it's not okay to manipulate people in this way. And here we get direct reference to salt again. Salt on her lips, salt clinging to the back of her hand. Once again, salt is present in a moment where Wednesday is, quote unquote, seducing a woman / outright manipulating a woman / we can follow that down a few more slashes to get to some very unpleasant territory. And I trust that the implication is sufficient and we don't necessarily need to delve into the question of consent in this regard. That would be fascinating. Yeah. The predatory imagery here, says Jonathan Nash. Lupine Grace, paw-like hand, says Skipa. And Elizabeth tries to convince me. She says, told you disco was sexy. I am less convinced now than I have ever been that disco is sexy. I'm pretty firm on that, yes. So the salt on Mom's hand is from Wednesday, says Becca. Possibly. I mean, we are told that she was drinking margaritas, so it is possible that, she's doing a salt on the back of the hand lick thing like you would do with tequila, or it is possible simply that, because it's the back of the hand, crucially. And I wonder if that is a remnant of some charm inscribed by Wednesday. Yeah, good. The charm no woman I want will ever want another, if I remember, says Jonathan. Yes, that is one of the charms that Wednesday lists off. Yeah. So what do we make of this? I mean, this is a knockout conclusion as we arrive in this part of the book, if you haven't already guessed, if you haven't already preempted it. Wednesday is Shadow's father. Odin is Shadow's father. And the giant question, which goes unasked at this point, is, so what does that make Shadow? And we're going to ask that question. We're going to engage directly with that question, but not now. Why not now? Because Shadow is dead. But even then, even as we understand that Shadow is dead, we must return to the question of his nature, because gods don't die like this. We know this now. Gods will eventually return. They will eventually resurface. Are the children that Odin fathers upon mortal women gods? Are they demigods? Where the hell did the demigods fit in our understanding of American gods and this combined aggregate mythology that Gaiman has created? Well, we don't know. And Becca, yes, is taking Jonathan's thought to its natural conclusion. Oh no, she never loved again and died alone. Yes, good. And Skiba points out too, Wednesday can take advantage of the fact she was drinking tequila. She may also, yes, have been drinking tequila in addition to margaritas. That would be entirely consistent. And yet the presence of salt in chapter 9 is such a specific thing, and Shadow's discomfort about that manipulation is so specific that it really stood out to me reading the book again. Yeah. A little semi-demi mini-god, says Skipa. Yeah, pretty much. Good. Good. And yes, those of us who are a little more familiar with Norse mythology, of course, are already moving ahead. We're already moving ahead to, well, wait, who is this guy, if that's the case? We'll get to all of that. We move on and meet Bast, and Shadow faces the next of his choices. She had brown hair and brown skin, and her eyes were the deep golden amber color of good honey. Her pupils were vertical slits. Do I know you? He asked, puzzled. Intimately, she said, and she smiled. I used to sleep on your bed, and my people have been keeping their eyes on you for me. She turned to the path ahead of him, pointed to the 3 ways he could go. Okay, she said, 1 way will make you wise, 1 way will make you whole, and 1 way will kill you. I'm already dead, I think, said Shadow. I died on the tree. She made a moo. There's Dad, she said, and there's Dead, and there's Dead. It's a relative thing. Then she smiled again. I could make a joke about that, you know. Something about dead relatives. No, said Shadow. It's okay. So, she said, which way do you want to go? I don't know, he admitted. She tipped her head to one side, a perfectly feline gesture. Suddenly, Shadow knew exactly who she was and where he knew her from. He felt himself beginning to blush. If you trust me, said Bast, I can choose for you. My people have been keeping an eye on you. This may resolve our cat question from the rest of the book. Was it Bast in Lakeside looking for Shadow right before Laura showed up and they had their discussion in the graveyard? Possibly. Was it a representative of Bast, another cat? Possibly. We don't know for sure. It is possible that by my people, Bast is referring to cats. It is possible also that she was referring in the traditional, you know, the traditional sense to her followers, her believers. The people of Bast would be people who believe in Bast, and also her people may be her family, may be the other residents of that little house, the little funeral home in Cairo. We'll get to some of those too. Was it their former intimacy? This is really interesting, this question from Skipa. Was it their former intimacy that allows Shadow to let Bast choose his fate? Well, possibly. But he also seems to simply be open at this point. Here he's moving through an experience that is in effect about him, and he seems to trust that there will be no malice here. He seems to trust that there will be no, I don't know, difficulty here, criticism here. I skipped over it in the last chapter here, but the appearance of Horus, the appearance of Jesus even at the tree, these are significant because he's still relating these presences to his own experience. He's aware that this is his story now, that he's not really literally of the world anymore, though we're going to challenge that too when we get to Ibis in a few minutes. Was Bast stopping Shadow killing himself somehow a touch of destiny, asks Tom. Did the influence of the cat keep Shadow on course for something greater? Yes, we must remember, and Jonathan is recalling the Easter's line, you brought me a blusher from the finale of the TV show. That's very good, yes. Yes, okay, let's unpack this. Is it their previous intimacy that allows Shadow to trust in Bast at this point? No, I don't think that it is. I think that knowing Bast is distinct from his trust of Bast, because we see an openness to the baseball cap wearing man in the previous chapter, an openness to Horus, an openness to Laura. We're seeing an openness to Zariah, of course. Here we're seeing these interactions that he has had previously. He's kind of mapping these interactions onto his current experience, but they may not be entirely real. I wonder how much of this is Shadow, again, I wonder how much of this is Shadow externalizing his own interiority, that's, you know, none of these people are really here, but he's imagining them, and how much of this is the real presence of the gods, and how much those two things are actually completely compatible, even codependent at this point in Shadow's experience. We'll see as we move on. Yeah, good. So here we get three more paths ahead of Shadow. We had two before, the way of hard lies and hard truths and fine lies. And here we get three. One will make you wise. One will make you whole. One will kill you. The way that this is framed suggests that these three things are mutually incompatible. That is to say that wisdom is incompatible with wholeness and is incompatible with death. You cannot be whole and dead, which suggests that in the dying, something is lost. You are incomplete thereafter, no matter what happens next. And you cannot be whole and wise. And that is curious, because wisdom here is suggestive of a kind of vulnerability, a kind of knowledge. You know, there is a reason that in various theologies, in basically every major theology in the world, we have some kind of notion of blissful innocence. We have some kind of desirable notion of the absence of wisdom being connected to joy and happiness and crucially presence, that kind of holistic thing. You know, let go of knowledge and you will be more yourself. You will be more whole. So we can choose wisdom, we can choose the state of being whole, or we can choose death. And as she says, there's dead, and there's dead, and there's dead. It's a relative thing. But here's the problem. She just listed 3 possible paths out of this situation. One will make you wise, one will make you whole, one will kill you. He says, I think I'm already dead. And she says, well, there's dead, and there's dead. Will each of these paths lead to death? Because she says, not one will lead to death, one will kill you. Is that the actual content of that path? Is it just that the path will kill you? Or does the path contain something which will kill you? Some other kind of state or condition that can be applied to you. Wisdom, wholeness, and what? Something that will be fatal. But the others possibly will kill you too. Yes, all paths lead to death here. We're deciding here in the YouTube chat, I think, which path we're going to take. Angela says, I would choose wholeness. Elizabeth would too. Aaron says he would choose wisdom. And Skipa too would choose wholeness. Oh, and Jonathan says, interestingly, wisdom is suggestive of learning things from outside yourself, where wholeness would be true knowledge of the self. That's absolutely true, Jonathan, and I think that there's a really interesting kind of Buddhist perspective there too. But what's curious here is that those are rendered incompatible by virtue of the choice. You cannot be both wise and whole is certainly the suggestion here. Yeah, good. A lot of us are going for wholeness. A few of us are going for wisdom. No one actually going for the third path. No one's curious about, hey, what is that? What is that weird third path that's just hanging out there? Good. Good. All right. So once again, he has to choose, and we get the remark. We get the exchange here between Bast and Shadow. Take the middle way, she said. Shadow hesitated. Are you really here? He asked. She tipped her head on one side, regarded him gravely, said nothing at all. What are you? He asked. What are you people? She yawned, showing a perfect dark pink tongue. Think of us as symbols. We're the dream that humanity creates to make sense of the shadows on the cave wall. Now go on. Keep moving. Your body is already growing cold. The fools are gathering on the mountain. The clock is ticking. Time still passes in the underworld. Shadow's body is growing cold. The fools are gathering on the mountain. We'll discover more about what that means in the next chapter. But there are a couple of important beats. Take the middle way, she says. Take the path leading toward wholeness. That is what she advises. And he hesitates when he gets this. Are you really here? He asks, as though that will somehow confirm or deny the advice that she has given to him. Can he trust her? Can he obey her instruction here? Well, it depends on whether or not she's here. And crucially, she does not respond. She just gives this, again, very feline gesture. It's explicitly called out as a feline gesture in the last slide. She tipped her head on one side, regarded him gravely, said nothing at all. What are you? He asked. What are you people? And she said, think of us as symbols. We're the dream that humanity creates to make sense of the shadows on the cave wall. This is in direct reference to the allegory of the cave, Plato's cave. This is one of the allegories, one of the metaphors that Plato uses in his work Republic, which was written between 514 and 520. And it is written, as a lot of Plato's works were, it is written as a fictional dialogue between Plato's brother, his real-life brother, Glaucon, and his mentor, Socrates. A little philosophical note for those of you who are interested. We talk about Socrates all the time, you guys, and not one single written word survives from Socrates. We don't know a single thing for sure that Socrates wrote. Everything that survives and has come down through the ages to us of Socrates was written by Plato. Socrates was basically used as a perfect idealized philosopher in Plato's writings. So that's where we get our notion of Socrates now. So in the allegory of the cave, Plato has Socrates describe a group of people who are living within a cave, and they are chained to the wall. They are chained so that they are facing the blank wall of the cave, okay? And this is all that they know. This is all that they have ever known. The wall of the cave is right there in front of them. They are chained so they cannot turn around. This is the entirety of their experience. And they watch the shadows pass across this wall cast by objects passing in front of the fire that is behind them, presumably also therefore their own shadows being cast upon the wall. And they give names to those shadows. They say, oh, this is a thing. When this thing happens in the external world, when I feel someone passing behind me and I see the shadow, well, that sensation of someone passing behind me, that is the shadow. These two things are coexistent. They are identical. And this is the name that I shall give to them. I shall call this shadow Frank. And that will be my experience of the world, is nothing but the sensation and the shadow. And that is it. So what is Bast saying here as she refers to this metaphor? We're the dream that humanity creates to make sense of the shadows on the cave wall. This implies that human beings are bound facing the cave wall, that we are only ever seeing shadows, that there is a greater truth of which we are ignorant. And gods are created through the infusion of belief and ritual faith. Gods are created in order to explain? Well, not quite explain. We're the dream that humanity creates to make sense of the shadows on the cave wall. One possible interpretation of that is to explain. But before she gets to that side of the metaphor, she says, think of us as symbols. We don't explain through gods. We simply define through gods. They are emblematic of the shadow itself, not an underlying methodology that seeks to explain the shadow. We're still ignorant of our condition. We don't understand that all we're seeing is the shadow on the wall there. Let me see here as we move into the YouTube chat. Questioning the cat reminds me of the Sphinx, says Becca. That's nice. That's a good pull. I hadn't thought of that. That's beautiful. Yes. Yes, good. Yes, and Haley says here in the YouTube chat, it's inverted because he's asking the cat instead of the cat asking him, and he is in a sense asking an appropriately, Sphinxian inscrutable riddle. What are you? What are you people? As if that is a question that could ever be completely answered, meaningfully answered. That's great. Yeah, good. Good. Okay. Jonathan says, we only experience parts of the universe, something we know is true. We don't experience the world in the infrared or the ultraviolet. Yes, that's true, but I would be cautious to kind of take a scientific perspective on this and kind of render human experience in terms of a scientific framework that accounts for things which we know exist, but are things which are provable and demonstrable, but which are outside of our immediate sensory experience. I think that what Bast is saying here in part, and certainly the allegory of the cave, if it's taken to its natural conclusion, its inevitable conclusion, is that even science, all of the tools that we have at our disposal, our entire conceptual framework, our entire means of apprehending the universe around us is part of the shadow play on the wall. That even as we try to prove that, basically we are proving that there are shadows that we cannot see which are also on the wall. And we explain this, or we represent this, we embody this, we codify this in symbols. And that is what the gods are. Gods are names. Because that's what a symbol is. A symbol represents something that is too complex or abstract or unknown to be properly defined. So we give it a symbol. We give it a name. We say America. We can't say that landmass, which represents and is embodied by these things and these virtues and these stories and these peoples and this history and this geography and this topology. We can't do that. So we give it a name. A name is a symbol that encapsulates the meaning of something. This is what I was talking about earlier with Shadow's name. Nominative determinism is a vital and powerful thing. The thing is shaped by its name, and the name is shaped by the thing. Names accrete meaning around them. Names accrete significance that go beyond, but are defined by the object itself, the object which is named. Names are symbols. Symbols are names. And that is what we have created. In our attempt to understand the allegory of Plato's cave here, the allegory of the shadow play on the wall cast by the fire behind us, again, crucially, if the fire is behind us, then we too are casting shadows on the wall. So in an attempt to understand many things, including ourselves, we have created gods. We gave them names. We made them names and symbols. So what is Bast? Well, at the risk of turning this into a discussion about Tom Bombadil, Bast is. Bast is Bast. I am that I am. That is what Bast is. That is what each of the gods are. They are the names that were given to them. They are the stories that are told about them, and that is all that they are. Odin is Odin. Mr. Ibis is, Mr. Ibis. We'll get to him in just a minute. Good. Good, yes. Princess Ostrich says, I love this. Humans need metaphors, not only descriptors. Yes, that's gorgeous. That's gorgeous. Because on the one hand, descriptors are untrustworthy, because descriptors are necessarily subjective, and thus your experience is not my experience, and we can't rely on that mediated middle ground of a single word. Instead, we turn to metaphor. We don't say, it's cold outside. We say it's as cold as an icebox outside. We say it's as cold as, Boston in February outside. We go to a metaphor because that metaphor embodies more than the literal derivative connection of the word. It's so funny because I've just been talking about this a lot in my critical reading class over the course of the last couple of weeks. So it's entirely appropriate that we should get to the importance of metaphors and names and symbols here in the pages of American Gods. Good. All right. We're getting some philosophy jokes here. This is perfect. Nihilist, says Princess Ostrich. There is no fire. We're only imagining the shadows, so we have something to do. Good. And Elizabeth says, at the risk of turning this into a discussion about Tom Bombadil, basically life with Alistair. Well, thank you, firstly, and you're welcome, secondly, and thirdly, there is something there, though, right? I am that I am. I am my name. That is enough. When Tom says to Frodo and the other hobbits, who are you alone, yourself, and unnamed? Who are you without your name? And the answer is nothing. But here, crucially, we're reminded that gods are created by names, and Shadow has just had his name taken from him, his real name. What does that mean for him here as he moves through the underworld? We'll see. We'll see. Let's get to, just one of my favorites, of course, Mr. Ibis. Here, let me share this slide. I'd forgotten that I took that other slide down. I forgot that I was talking directly here to you guys. This is the appearance of Mr. Ibis. The smoke stung Shadow's eyes. He wiped the tears away with his hand, and through the smoke he thought he saw a tall man in a suit with gold-rimmed spectacles. The smoke cleared, and the boatman was once more a half-human creature with the head of a river bird. Mr. Ibis? Good to see you, Shadow, said the creature with Mr. Ibis's voice. Do you know what a psychopomp is? Shadow thought he knew the word, but it had been a long time. He shook his head. That's a fancy term for an escort, said Mr. Ibis. We all have so many functions, so many ways of existing. In my own vision of myself, I am a scholar who lives quietly and pens his little tales and dreams about a past that may or may not ever have existed. And that is true as far as it goes. But I am also, in one of my capacities, like so many of the people you have chosen to associate with, a psychopomp. I escort the living to the world of the dead. I thought this was the world of the dead, said Shadow. No, not per se. It's more of a preliminary. The boat slipped and slid across the mirror surface of the underground pool. The bird head of the creature at the prow stared ahead, and then Mr. Ibis said, without moving its beak, You people talk about the living and the dead as if they were two mutually exclusive categories, and you cannot have a river that is also a road, or a song that is also as if you cannot have a river that is also a road, or a song that is also a color. The mutual exclusivity of living and dead is fundamental to human experience. That is one of the things which defines our understanding of the word. It is one of the oldest words, one of the oldest concepts that is embedded in any native lexicon. One of the first words that becomes necessary in human culture and human community is alive and dead. Drawing the opposition between those two things is one of the first kind of abstract markers of incipient human culture. It is one of the first things that we learn to define. We define me versus you, that which is internal to me versus that which is external to me, and we define alive and dead. This is vital. And yet, Ibis says that these two things are not mutually incompatible, that these two things are not mutually exclusive, as if you cannot have a river that is also a road. Metaphorically, you can, I suppose, but not literally, or a song that is also a color. Again, synesthesia aside, metaphorically you can, but literally you cannot. Here again, we're seeing the push into an inhuman understanding of the world. The inability to have a river that is also a road or a song that is also a color is our inability to understand the source of the shadow that has fallen upon the cave wall. We see the consequence of the thing, not the true thing itself. Thus, we literalize. Thus, we reduce. This is part of the ongoing metaphor that is pulled through here. Oh, I should say too, I think this just blazed past in the YouTube chat here. Psychopomps, from the Greek word psychopompos, literally meaning the guide of souls. It's a weird word. It feels as though it's an oddly ungainly and clumsy word. Psychopomps feels like it should be, you know, some kind of superhero cyberpunk, you know, I don't know. It's a cyberpunk cheerleader attack weapon is what it is. If you imagine like Sailor Moon crossed with Deus Ex or the works of William Gibson, then that to me feels like what a psychopomp should be, or perhaps just the antagonist in a new season of Power Rangers, perhaps. But no, it is an actual Greek word, psychopompos, literally meaning the guide of souls. The role, crucially, of the psychopomp is not to judge the deceased, but simply to provide safe passage. Arguably the most famous, of course, is Charon, the ferryman across the Styx in Greek mythology. The Egyptian god Anubis. Interestingly, Anubis, not Thoth, is traditionally thought to be a psychopomp. Hermes and Hecate, Mercury, and Vanth from the Etruscan pantheon there. There are many, many others too. So psychopomps are simply, and technically speaking, simply guides of the soul. There's nothing embedded within the word psychopomp that says into the realm of the afterlife, you know, or into the realm of the dead or anything like that. Just the guide of the soul, but commonly psychopomps are those who escort into the realm of the dead for judgment, for whatever awaits them, effectively. But there is no actual judgment associated with them. Yes. Good. Let me see. A man is not dead so long as his name is remembered, says Jonathan. Don't remember where that's from, but it's stuck somewhere in the back of my head. Yes, good. Yeah, good. Good. Okay. Jonathan says that description is one of the most baffling concepts I think I've ever heard. I'm sorry, that I may have yes, I may have wandered away from the path of wisdom there. Tom says, mate, if Adam Jensen turns up on the show, that would be amazing. Adam Jensen, the protagonist in the, oh, I almost said second Deus Ex game because everyone forgets Deus Ex Invisible War. I don't forget Deus Ex Invisible War. Adam Jensen is the protagonist of the third and fourth Deus Ex games, the fourth of which I haven't actually played, but the third is pretty good. Okay, never mind. Forget about cyberpunk storytelling. Forget about psychopomps for now, because we have something much, much more important to get to, and I'm rapidly running out of time. 3 more slides to go. Let's see what we can do here. So I'm dead, said Shadow. He was getting used to the idea. Or I'm going to be dead? We're on our way to the Hall of the Dead. I requested that I be the one to come for you. Why? I'm a psychopomp. I like you. You were a hard worker. Why not? Because, Shadow marshaled his thoughts, because I never believed in you. Because I don't know much about Egyptian mythology. Because I didn't expect this. What happened to St. Peter and the pearly gates? The long-beaked white head shook from side to side gravely. It doesn't matter that you don't believe in us, said Mr. Ibis. We believed in you. I tried, you guys. I tried. I didn't want to mention the Psycho Pirate, but here Jonathan Nash is mentioning the Psycho Pirate from DC Comics. I didn't want to do it, but there it is. Okay, yes. Some fine day I'm going to do a discussion of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then we're going to get a really good opportunity to talk about the Psycho Pirate. So I'm dead, said Shadow. He was getting used to the idea, or I'm going to be dead. Well, we're on our way to the Hall of the Dead. I requested I be the one to come from you. Again, no, Shadow. You're not dead, and this is not a binary condition anyway. You're kind of dead. It is true that you died, but it is not true that you are dead. Shadow asks, why? Why are you the one who requested to come for me? And we get 4 responses. I'm a psychopomp. I like you. You were a hard worker. Why not? Are those 4 perspectives on the same reason? Or are those 4 distinct reasons? I'm a psychopomp. I like you. You were a hard worker. Why not? Well, the truth is, of course, that none of those things are important. None of those reasons are the actual reason. The actual reason is embedded there at the end. It doesn't matter that you didn't believe in us, said Mr. Ibis. We believed in you. There has been a manipulation of Shadow's experience by gods, well, for at least what? The last 3 years, at least that, much, much longer. I mean, he was conceived by a god, so technically, you know, his entire life has been a manipulation by the gods. What does it mean for Ibis to believe in gods? We've talked before about, sorry, what does it mean for Ibis to believe in Shadow? We've talked before about belief between gods and the fact that belief is clearly not enough to sustain a god, or at least the belief of another god is not enough to sustain a god. The Zariahs all believe in each other, but they're not stronger for it. Chernobog believes in them and is believed in by them, but he's not stronger for it. Gods can decline and die, even though they are common knowledge among other gods, because it's not about awareness, it's not about knowledge, it's about belief. So what is Ibis saying? Is he saying that they literally believed in Shadow? That they prayed to Shadow, worshipped Shadow in the way that human beings worship gods? No. No, I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he's using this term colloquially. I think he's saying that we believed in you. We defined you. We shaped you. We wanted you to be the thing that you are going to be. We wanted you, perhaps is closest. We had hope for you. I think that is what Ibis is saying, because there are too many other points in the novel so far where we question the notion of interdeity faith and interdeity belief. That doesn't seem to work, at least in the traditional sense. So this belief, although I suppose that doesn't preclude the possibility of a kind of powerless belief flowing from gods, that perhaps gods just lack the necessary nutritive force, in their belief. It's kind of empty calories, the belief of a god. Oh, this is interesting. Yes, Angela says, Excelsior topic, Crisis on Infinite Earths. No, probably not. I would love to do an in-depth series on, okay, very briefly, Crisis on Infinite Earths was a mid-1980s limited series from DC Comics, which took 50 years of established continuity, crashed it into one titanic universe, multiverse-spanning event, and tried to make sense of it. It is absolutely fascinating. It is also incredibly deep and complex, and I don't think that it's the kind of thing that we'd be able to get into on Excelsior with sufficient depth. But I would really like to do a seminar series much like this one, looking at the entirety of Crisis on Infinite Earths. That may possibly happen at some point. Haley asks, from what we've heard before, the belief of gods isn't important, or is it just not important to other gods? Yes, that's exactly the point that I was just making there. I think you've pinned that beautifully. Becca says, so the past tense of dead is liminal existence. Past tense of dead is liminal existence. I mean, from a certain perspective, isn't all existence liminal? We move from, I mean, even if you are confident in the existence of an afterlife, or even if we are confident in the cycle of reincarnation and recreation, there was a time before the universe existed, and there will presumably be a time after the universe existed. So therefore, we are constantly moving from one state of non-existence to another state of non-existence. Therefore, all things arguably are liminal, depending on your personal philosophy, I suppose. And Skipa says, yes, yeah. Angela says it was set up since that meeting between Wednesday and his mom. Yeah, absolutely. And Skipa says Wednesday spoke about the fact that his kind can't have kids easily, so the mere existence of Shadow would be of interest to any other gods. Yes. When was the last time a god was born? Although, is that even what we're talking about? Are we confident at this point that Shadow is a god? I mean, okay, a few of us have jumped ahead in the text, and we know that, yeah, we're pretty confident. But what does that mean? If that is true, then what are we to make of Shadow's human existence? Ibis says in that previous slide, your kind. He's talking about Shadow as if he is human. Does Ibis know the reality here? What are we to make of all of this experience? And this is what I mean when I say that we could spend, gosh, 6 hours deconstructing every line of this chapter and seeking to understand it. But I'm not sure that the ultimate answer there would be more informative than the kind of impressionistic rush that we get. Shadow is having a dream. He is experiencing something that is kind of non-linear and subjective. And so are we as we're reading this chapter. So I think that those two things combined work really quite beautifully together. Okay, we must push on because I am, 5 minutes out. Here we go. Let's do this thing. The hands of Anubis came down, huge dark hands, and they picked Shadow up and brought him close. The Jackalhead examined him with bright and glittering eyes, examined him as dispassionately as Mr. Jekyll had examined the dead girl on the slab. Shadow knew that all his faults, all his failings, all his weaknesses were being taken out and weighed and measured, that he was in some way being dissected and sliced and tasted. We do not always remember the things that do no credit to us. We justify them, cover them in bright lies or with the thick dust of forgetfulness. All of the things that Shadow had done in his life of which he was not proud, all of the things he wished he had done otherwise or left undone, came at him then in a swirling storm of guilt and regret and shame, and he had nowhere to hide from them. He was as naked and as open as a corpse on a table, and dark Anubis, the jackal god, was his prosector and his prosecutor and his persecutor. Please, said Shadow, please stop. But the examination did not stop. Every lie he had ever told, every object he had stolen, every hurt he had inflicted on another person, all the little crimes and the tiny murders that make up the day, each of these things and more were extracted and held up to the light by the jackal-headed judge of the dead. Shadow began to weep painfully in the palm of the dark god's hand. He was a tiny child again, as helpless and as powerless as he had ever been. Interesting. Angela asks a question here in the YouTube chat. Is Shadow the first true American god born in America? Well, we'll get more perspectives on that as we continue through. Yes. And quotes Jekyll here by inference. That feather is damn heavy. Yeah. This is stunning. This is, I mean, so beautifully written. It does, I must admit. Okay, let's look there at that third paragraph, because I think this is where we hit our height. We do not always remember the things that do no credit to us. We justify them, cover them in bright lies, or with the thick dust of forgetfulness. This is gorgeous. And you can see here, we do not always remember. What is this sudden narrative voice? This is, again, the intrusion of the unseen narrator of American Gods, who, by the way, doesn't show up very often. And when he does, gosh, doesn't he sound a lot like Mr. Ibis? We remember this discussion from way back in the first chapter, the second chapter. We would get these odd moments where the literary camera would move up, and away from Shadow. We would get this far broader perspective than we could possibly get from Shadow's personal experience. And in that architected language, there is something of Mr. Ibis's presence. We can imagine there. Shadow knew that all his faults, all his failings, all his weaknesses were being taken out and weighed and measured, that he was in some way being dissected and sliced and tasted, and all of that repetition feels like that expansive voice that we get from Shadow when the narrative goes high, when the narrative is elevated here. Shadow knew that all his faults, all his failings, all his weaknesses, 3-beat, were being taken out and weighed and measured, 3-beat, that he was in some way being dissected and sliced and tasted, 3-beat. There it is. That's Shadow's elevated language. But then we get the transition. We do not always remember the things that do no credit to us. We justify them, cover them in bright lies or with the thick dust of forgetfulness. All of the things that Shadow had done in his life of which he was not proud. That reads to me like Ibis. That reads to me like narrative intrusion. And we also get the beat that is, for me, almost too far. The cuteness of that last 3-beat contained within that paragraph. He was as naked and as open as a corpse on a table, and dark Anubis, the jackal god, was his prosector and his prosecutor and his persecutor. Prosector being a, what is the word that I'm looking for? The word has completely fled me. Someone who cuts and slices into dead bodies. That is terrible. The word has completely fled from my mind. That is a terrible thing. I do apologize. But he is, yes, he is dissecting. He is a dissector. That is the word that I was looking for. A prosector dissects is effectively what I'm saying. So the prosector, the prosecutor, the persecutor. I don't know about you guys. Is that a little cute? Is that a little on the nose? Is that a little like maybe we worked a little too hard to get there? I don't know. I do admire it though. It does always throw me out when I get to that part. I'm suddenly I am reminded brutally at that point that I am reading a novel, that I'm reading a novel by an incredibly talented author, but a novel nonetheless. It takes me out of the story. So here we see the test, and what happens as Shadow's guilt is weighed, what happens as his heart is weighed, as his sins of omission and commission are balanced against his virtue. He begins to weep painfully in the palm of the dark god's hand. He was a tiny child again, as helpless and as powerless as he has ever been. In the weighing of these things, there is a sense in which they are being taken from him. They're being removed from him. There is a sense in which he is being cleansed. Last night in my critical reading class, I talked a little about Tolkien's allegorical short story Leaf by Niggle, in which the allegory relates to the kind of specifically Catholic Christian afterlife. And he spends time in purgatory. And the concept of purgatory is that one spends time there in order to be purged, in order to be made ready for heaven. And there is a sense here too in which Shadow is being purged as well as being judged. Postmortem Slicey Man suggests Tom Corpsey make cuts. That's very good. Yes. A dissection was the word that I was stumbling toward. I'm very embarrassed by that. Okay, we're actually out of time here, but we're going to, of course, finish up the last beat here in the chapter, and this is it. Shadow says, so now I get to choose where I go next. Choose, said Thoth, or we can choose for you. No, said Shadow, it's okay. It's my choice. Well, roared Anubis. I want to rest now, said Shadow. That's what I want. I want nothing, no heaven, no hell, no anything. Just let it end. You're certain? Asked Thoth. Yes, said Shadow. Mr. Jekyll opened the last door for Shadow, and behind that door there was nothing, not darkness, not even oblivion, only nothing. Shadow accepted it completely and without reservation, and he walked through the door into nothing with a strange, fierce joy. I guess we can circle back to the actual consequence of Shadow's choice as we move into next week's reading, but it is important to note the three beat of choice that we've seen here, that in the first instance he is presented with two paths, in the second instance he is presented with three paths, in the third instance he is presented with myriad paths, with basically his free choice, but still he has to choose. The first time he chooses emphatically, he wants truth. The second time he yields to Bast because he doesn't readily know how to choose between wisdom and wholeness and whatever it is that will kill him. But here he knows again. Here he has reached the point of certainty, and he wants nothingness. Not oblivion, not absence, but nothingness. He wants it to be done. He wants it to be over. He wants this to be the end of his story. And when we talk about the structural climax of this book, there is a sense in which this could be seen as the structural climax of a part of Shadow's existence, but not ultimately all of his existence. We'll return, I think, to this scene as we see what happens to Shadow next in next week's reading. Next week's session, I'm sorry, that says Friday. It shouldn't say Friday. It should say Tuesday, because it's going to be Tuesday the 25th. Pay no attention to the words on the slide. They are liars. Tuesday, July the 25th, 2017 at 3 p.m. Eastern, the same time as this week's session, chapters 17 and 18. We have two more regular sessions in our discussion of the novel of American Gods, and then a bonus session in which we are going to talk about the short stories, Black Dog and Monarch of the Glen. I can't wait for those two. Guys, thank you all so much for being here with me today. Thank you all so much for your thoughts and for your perspectives. If you have more thoughts as we move forward through the week to come before we come back to American Gods once again, then please let me know. Let me have them. You can email me directly, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter using the hashtag StormsOTW. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much. I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, take care.